Tonight, we explore the legend of beings so ancient and so powerful that the Vatican did not just deny them, but renamed them to suit a narrative of control. They were once called the Watchers, the luminous teachers who descended from the stars before the first cities rose from the mud of Sumer. These celestial beings were not distant myths, but memories of gods who walked beside men, sharing knowledge given freely in an act of divine generosity. To the ancient Sumerians, these were the sky gods known as Anu, Enki, and Enlil, who arrived in fiery chariots and brought with them the gift of civilization itself. They whispered the language of mathematics, the secrets of the forge, and the art of shaping metal from stone. For a time, the world flourished under their compassionate guidance, yet this light was eventually mistaken for rebellion by those who rose to power centuries later. The tablets of Sumer call them the teachers of light, yet the Book of Enoch calls them the fallen, illustrating how two stories born from the same truth can be twisted depending on who is allowed to tell it. Somewhere between heaven and history, that truth was buried as the church needed heaven to be unreachable, and thus they buried those who once bridged the gap. The Watchers became symbols of disobedience, their compassion rewritten as corruption, and their desire to lift humanity from fear was recast as a contamination of blood. Yet the Sumerians never spoke of evil. They spoke of visitors whose knowledge rewrote the destiny of a species. They were architects who carved the first laws of matter and motion into the clay of creation, bridging the line between miracle and science. Among these architects, Enki was known as the Serpent of Wisdom, who gifted mankind knowledge forbidden by other gods. His temple, the Abzu, was described as a house filled with light that hummed like thunder, a place of impossible technology beyond its time. Inside it, the gods stored the black stones of heaven, devices capable of healing the sick or summoning storms. If the stories in clay are true, then humanity's first gods were visitors whose presence blurred the boundary between flesh and spirit. They crossed the boundaries of heaven to help a species still crawling through the dust, teaching us language, metal, and the secrets of the stars. Reclaiming this history means realizing that wisdom was never meant to be forbidden, and that our ancestors were once the students of the luminous. Long before the church existed, there was a faith of fire and truth built on the idea that every human being carried within them a spark of divine fire. This ancient philosophy, rooted in the teachings of Zoroaster, spoke of a conscience brighter than any altar flame. To the ancient Persians, fire was not worshipped as a god, but treated as a mirror of conscience, a living symbol of clarity that reminded every individual that purity was something kept alive within themselves. They believed that the universe was ordered by a sacred law called Asha, the rhythm of creation and the mirror of reality that exists beyond any throne or scripture. To live in Asha was to see clearly, to act rightly, and to become light itself through the power of personal reason and moral choice. The Magi, the original keepers of this fire, were not magicians in the sense of modern myth, but priests of the sky and guardians of knowledge so old that even empires bowed to it. They were astronomers who believed the heavens were a language of morality written across the night, where each star was a word and each constellation a sentence. Their law was simple: good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Every lie was a shadow cast on the soul, while every act of kindness was a spark of divine fire. This was a faith that needed no temple or priest, for truth was not to be worshipped, but lived. However, light like that cannot be controlled, and for those who built power from darkness and hierarchy, such freedom was unforgivable. The parallels between the Sumerian Watchers and the Persian Magi are striking, as both systems emphasized the transfer of celestial knowledge to the human starseed. The Watchers taught humans how to read the movements of the planets, while the Magi practiced a faith where every action echoed through the cosmos like ripples on a lake. Both traditions taught that salvation was earned through integrity and awareness, not bought with offerings or granted through ritual. This original gospel of choice and responsibility meant that humans were co-creators of their reality. By aligning one's deeds with the cosmic order, the divine spark within could be reignited, lifting humanity beyond fear and into the radiance of the stars. In the ancient high deserts of Persia, where the horizon was wide and the stars were endless, fire temples were open to the night to receive the celestial energy. Inside these temples, the sacred flame burned without smoke or end, maintained by priests who understood that its preservation was a sacred science. Every movement followed a rhythm of cleansing, and no shadow was allowed to fall across the flame. To the Magi, fire was consciousness in motion and the visible shape of divine awareness. It transformed everything it touched, yet remained unchanged, mirroring the nature of truth itself. This fire was meant to be an inner awakening, a quiet clarity that glows when one chooses understanding over fear. The architecture of these temples was not merely for ritual, but was an early form of environmental and resonant engineering. Archaeologists have found stone channels carved with millimeter precision and vent shafts designed to keep flames alive for centuries. These were the inventions of people who believed that the sacred and the scientific were the same flame burning in different languages. Similarly, the Watcher's Temple, the Abzu, was described as a house of light that hummed like thunder, suggesting that the ancients utilized sound and frequency as tools of creation. They believed certain frequencies could open gates between worlds, and the first language spoken was said to be one of light and illumination woven together. This connection between frequency, light, and biology was the true inheritance of the starseed. The oldest texts on Earth already knew the code of life long before modern science could describe it, with diagrams aligning ancient glyphs to genetic codons. The Watchers left their language behind as a key, knowing that one day humanity would learn to see light as communication rather than mere illumination. They wanted us to realize that we were never meant to worship the heavens, but to converse with them. By tending the inner flame and aligning with the frequency of Asha, the human graduate could reclaim the spark that was always inside, moving past the managed darkness toward the eternal dawn of awareness. Despite the brilliance of these early ages, the architects of silence worked tirelessly to ensure that humanity forgot its luminous ancestors. When the Church rose to power, it needed heaven to be unreachable to maintain its role as the sole gatekeeper of mystery. Consequently, the bringers of knowledge were recast as rebels, and the compassionate savior Enki was rewritten as the serpent of temptation. What was once divine generosity was branded as heresy, and the price of compassion was eternal exile into the realms of myth and demonology. The Vatican censored history with invisible scissors, cutting away pages that might spark independent thought and erasing names from every record. In the quiet glow of candlelight, monks became the editors of memory, scraping ink from parchments to purge any link between creation and the stars. They burned entire pages not to destroy knowledge, but to rewrite it, transforming cosmology into theology and myth into weapon. The ancient sky gods were reimagined as angels, and the Watchers who descended to guide humanity became rebels cast out of heaven. This was the greatest rewrite in human history, a strategy to build authority by controlling the very origins of our species. They told the people that the heavens were no longer filled with many beings, only one, and any who questioned this were consorting with demons. Yet traces of the Watchers and the Magi still hum beneath layers of translation and fear. Their symbols are carved into cathedrals, and their geometry hides in holy architecture. Even the name of Lucifer, meaning light-bringer, echoes the forgotten story of those who brought light to mankind. The real fall did not occur in heaven. It happened on earth when humans chose obedience over understanding and fear instead of reason. Reclaiming the first descent is the act of unsealing the future, recognizing that the teachers of light never truly left. They are still watching, still teaching, and still waiting for us to reclaim the spark that was always inside us. The amnesia is ending, and the fire that once hid beneath the earth is beginning to breathe again. The history of humanity is not a record of truth, but what was left behind when myth was weaponized by the architects of silence. When the church rose to power, it recognized that to control the present, it had to own the origins of the human species. They needed heaven to be unreachable. And to achieve this, they had to bury those who once bridged the gap between the stars and the earth. The Watchers, who were once celebrated as the luminous teachers and the bringers of civilization, were systematically rewritten into symbols of disobedience and corruption. Their immense compassion for humanity was reframed as a sin, and their act of sharing divine knowledge was branded as a treacherous rebellion against a singular, distant Godhead. This was the birth of managed amnesia, a strategy where the radiant history of the First Age was polished into the dark, frightening allegories of the Second Age. Inside the scriptoria of early monasteries, monks sat hunched over parchments, acting not just as keepers of memory, but as its clinical editors. By the Middle Ages, the Church had begun shaping not only what people believed, but what they were allowed to remember. They utilized the filter of translation to dull the light of ancient wisdom, replacing the original meanings of the Sumerian and Persian texts with concepts of terror and damnation. Where the tablets spoke of light as wisdom and generosity, the redactors replaced it with the name for pride and temptation. The same story of the teacher who loved mankind enough to defy the heavens was retold in Genesis as the serpent who tempted Eve, turning a savior into a deceiver. By weaponizing myth, the Church ensured that the human graduate would fear the very knowledge meant to liberate them, equating curiosity with sin and silence with holiness. The redaction was not limited to words, but extended to the total dematerialization of the sky gods. The Anunnaki, the physical visitors who walked upon the earth in fiery chariots, were reimagined as immaterial angels or fallen demons. This linguistic and theological shift ensured that the technical reality of our creators was hidden beneath the heavy robes of religious tradition. The Church stripped the ancient myths of their stars and their freedom, repackaging them as a doctrine of absolute obedience. They told the people that the heavens were no longer filled with many beings, only one, and any who questioned this unity were branded as heretics consorting with demons. This cosmic cover-up marked the boundary between an age of enlightenment and an age of managed fear, where humanity's memory was rewritten line by line and word by word. One of the most clinical aspects of the historical firewall was the systematic attempt to destroy the Zoroastrian scriptures and the memory of the Magi. The Avesta, which was said to have once filled 12,000 cowhides with the laws of truth and the rhythm of creation, was hunted and seized as trophies of conquest. The architects of silence recognized that a faith built on the worship of wisdom and the sovereignty of conscience was an unforgivable threat to a city built on hierarchy and command. To solve this crisis, they renamed the Magi as magicians and mystics, and labeled their sacred tongue as demonic glossolalia disguised as knowledge. In monasteries from Byzantium to Rome, strange orders arrived to remove any passage that linked the story of creation to the Persian accounts of light and free will. The monks were ordered to scrape the ink from their parchments with knives until the forbidden words were gone. They burned entire pages, not to destroy knowledge, but to replace it with a sanitized version of history that served the church's agenda. In the quiet of candlelight, the worship of wisdom known as Mazda was turned into the worship of idols, and its prophets were dismissed as fire worshippers or sorcerers. The triadic formula of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds was quietly rephrased and woven into new scripture, presented as a revelation rather than an inheritance. This was the culling of the embers, a process where the church sought to extinguish any idea that suggested the divine spark lived within every person without the need for an institutional mediator. Despite the flames and the scraping, the Avestan codes refused to die completely. Scribes who witnessed the texts before they were purged often left hidden notes in the margins, words visible only when held to fire, declaring that the stars remember what the church forgets. Some manuscripts were smuggled along trade routes by exiles, hidden in the hollows of statues or tucked between the pages of medical texts. The Vatican's secret archives hold the confiscated records of these purges, including inventories where books like the Codex Persicus were crossed out and labeled as lost, though they actually remain locked behind the walls of silence. Reclaiming the purged codes is the act of recognizing that our moral vocabulary did not begin with the councils, but was inherited from a radiant and ancient science of the soul that the Church tried to bury forever. The Church's clinical editing reached its climax in the rewriting of the Great Flood and the role of the compassionate Savior. Long before the story of Noah, the people of Sumer told an identical tale where the hero was Zu-Sudra, and the flood was not a punishment for sin, but a warning of a coming cycle. In the original records, the Watcher, known as Enki, defied the divine order to save humanity, speaking to Zu-Sudra in dreams to guide him in building a vessel for life. This was an act of compassion and responsibility, a cycle meant to reset the balance of the planetary laboratory. However, when the Church translated these records into scripture, they flipped the meaning of the oldest moral story on Earth. The compassionate Savior Enki was rewritten as the serpent, the deceiver, and the fallen one. The flood, which originally marked the boundary between ages and the cleansing of memory, was turned into a tool of divine wrath and a warning about obedience. The message was simplified: follow the divine command or face total destruction. By turning the Watchers into tempters and the flood into a punishment, the Church taught submission instead of curiosity and silence instead of wisdom. They erased the fact that humanity survived not because of blind obedience, but because of a teacher's warning and the courage of those who listened to the luminous ones. The Sumerian records even described the sky changing and the stars resetting their clocks, details that were redacted to keep the starseed in a state of chronological amnesia. This systematic filtration ensured that any truth older than faith itself was branded as a dangerous illusion meant to confuse the faithful. The Vatican scholars classified these ancient findings under the term non-human interference, a label used to hide the technical reality of beings who shaped humanity through instruction rather than miracles. They could not allow mankind to learn it had once been taught by others, for the foundation of their own authority would fracture, so the clay and the scrolls were moved beneath street. Peter's basilica into vaults sealed since the time of Constantine, or ground to dust to erase their existence. Reclaiming the story of the flood and the Savior is the act of recognizing that we were never victims of a divine tantrum, but the graduates of a celestial mission that the architects of silence tried to hide in the dark. Throughout the centuries of managed amnesia, those who dared to uncover the buried truth found themselves silenced and their work confiscated. The Inquisition was not merely about religious dogma, but about the control of history and the suppression of any knowledge that placed power back in the hands of the individual. In the 13th century, entire libraries filled with ancient geometry and herbal cures vanished in smoke, while star cults that claimed to follow the original messengers were destroyed overnight. To the Church, a faith that placed understanding in the mind of the individual was a terminal threat to the structure of obedience, and thus villages were burned and entire families disappeared to maintain the firewall. One such truth-teller was Giordano Bruno, who was burned alive in the year 1600 for suggesting that the universe was infinite and that the beings in Scripture were visitors from distant lights. His ashes rose into the sky he believed was alive, while artists and scholars who agreed with him were forced to destroy their works or hide their secrets in the margins of paintings. Even Galileo, who echoed the forbidden truth that the heavens were not fixed but alive, was branded a traitor to heaven. The Church used fear and censorship to ensure that any invention or idea that challenged the managed history had to pass through the gate of institutional approval. They turned the tools of progress into the marks of heresy, condemning those who built clocks to measure the heavens or practiced medicine without a blessing. The silence was perfect, yet curiosity survived. The light they tried to extinguish simply changed form, moving through secret societies, art, and music. Within the Vatican itself, Jesuit astronomers continued their work under the guise of theology, charting the heavens while pretending to pray. They quietly copied the very astronomical charts they publicly condemned, filling the archives with more accurate records than any public document of the time. These fragments remain as reminders that the truth is resilient and that the real fall of humanity occurred when we allowed ourselves to be guided by fear instead of reason. Reclaiming the legacy of the truth-tellers is the final phase of unsealing the future, recognizing that the real devil was never curiosity, but the teaching that humans should be afraid of their own radiant minds. Deep beneath the cobblestones of the Vatican City, beyond the public eyes and the reach of standard history, lies the central nervous system of human amnesia known as the Secret Archives. This is not merely a library of religious decrees, but a fortress designed to contain the unedited source material of the First Age. For centuries, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, have served as the primary custodians of this library of shadows, tasked with classifying, translating, and ultimately concealing the most sensitive data regarding our origins. They are the ones who possess the intellectual discipline and the linguistic mastery to navigate the thousands of miles of shelving filled with forbidden scrolls, lost gospels, and the technical logs of the celestial architects. The Vatican understands that in the game of global management, the control of information is the absolute control of reality, and they have entrusted the keys to this power to an elite order of scholars and spies. The archives house documents that describe the physical reality of the sky beings whom the Church rebranded as angels and demons. Among these are the original Aramaic and Greek fragments of the Book of Enoch, which provide a far more technical and biological description of the sky observers than any version available to the public. The Jesuits have utilized their access to these vaults to identify the T anomaly, the patterns of extraterrestrial intervention that occurred long before the first cross was ever carved. They are the librarians of the silence, deciding which parts of the human story are allowed to survive and which must remain buried in the dark. Reclaiming the knowledge within the library of shadows is the act of recognizing that our history was not lost to time, but was systematically filed away by those who believed that the truth is a privilege of the institutional elite. Within the restricted sections, there are specialized units whose only task is to maintain the layers of concealment. They utilize complex codes and ancient ciphers to protect the most dangerous information, ensuring that even if a document is discovered, its true meaning remains hidden from the uninitiated. The Jesuits have used the silence of these vaults to curate a reality where the human graduate feels like a lonely and accidental species, rather than recognizing that it is the heir to a radiant and well-documented celestial education. The Library of Shadows is the ultimate vault of secrets, containing the proof that we were never alone and that our potential has been managed by a silent order in black robes for 500 years. One of the most dangerous and protected sections of the archive is the collection of the Nephilim restricted files. These dossiers contain the clinical reports of archaeological discoveries that provide empirical proof of the hybrid lineages of the First Age. As the physical evidence of the Watcher's presence began to emerge from the sands of the Middle East and the caves of the Levant, the Vatican recognized that they could no longer rely on spiritual allegory alone. They established specialized Jesuit research orders whose secret mission was to identify, acquire, and suppress any physical artifact or inscription that confirmed the existence of a high-frequency biological interface between the stars and the Earth. These files include detailed photographs and chemical analyses of anomalous skeletal remains that do not follow the standard evolutionary path. The restricted files also detail the discovery of resonant stone chambers and frequency-emitting devices found in the ruins of the pre-flood city-states. The Jesuits have kept these reports sealed to ensure that the public remains in a state of wonder and mystery, looking to the Church for explanations that are already hidden in the dark. They understand that if the starseed recognized the technical function of the ancient megaliths as resonant batteries for the celestial frequency, the entire foundation of religious worship would be shattered. Within the vaults, there are maps of the planetary ley lines and the specific nodes where the Watchers established their high-frequency teaching centers, nodes that the Church has systematically occupied with its most important basilicas and shrines. The Nephilim restricted files also track the survival of the radiant bloodlines that carry a higher concentration of the celestial signature. The Church has used this information to manage these lineages, often coopting them into the administrative structures of the order while erasing their true origin from the public record. By sealing the evidence of our hybrid heritage, the architects of shadows have ensured that we remain in a state of biological amnesia, unaware of the radiant potential that still flows within our very cells. Reclaiming the Nephilim restricted files is the act of recognizing that the proof of our makers is not a matter of faith, but a matter of physical evidence that has been systematically hidden from our eyes by the gatekeepers of Rome. Hidden within the deepest layers of the secret vaults, the Vatican guards the star maps of the Magi, the original celestial charts provided by the Watchers to the first generation of human graduates. These are not the primitive drawings of early astronomers, but are sophisticated depictions of the cosmic motherboard, showing the resonant pathways between the stars and the specific frequencies required to navigate the higher dimensions of reality. The Jesuits, acting as the primary astronomers of the Vatican, are the ones who manage these maps, ensuring that the technical instructions for celestial alignment remain a secret, reserved only for the elite administrators of the Second Age. They recognize that these maps are the keys to the ultimate graduation of the species, as they provide the data required to re-enter the high-frequency network of the original mission. The star maps describe the orbital mechanics of the wandering planets and the precise timing of the precessional cycles that govern the opening and closing of the historical firewalls. The architects of shadows realized that a population that understood the predictable cycles of time would be impossible to control through the fear of a sudden and unpredictable judgment. Therefore, they replaced the science of celestial mechanics with the prophecy of religious apocalypse, turning the technical stages of our evolution into a terrifying mystery of divine will. The Vatican's secret archives hold the original astronomical calculations that were used by the Watchers to calibrate the planetary laboratory, information that the Jesuits have utilized in secret to plan their own global agendas. These maps also reveal the true identity of the stars that were worshipped in the ancient world. They show that the sky beings were not abstract spirits, but were physical administrators operating from specific locations within the solar system. By turning these physical locations into spiritual realms, the redactors of history ensured that the human graduate would never look toward the sky with a scientific mind. They wanted us to believe that the heavens were the exclusive domain of the divine, rather than recognizing that they are the original home of our radiant heritage. Reclaiming the star maps of the Magi is the act of recognizing that we are a cosmic species with a well-defined place in the universal hierarchy, and that our graduation is a matter of technical synchronization with the frequency of the stars. The final phase of our journey into the Library of Shadows is the realization that the most important records were never kept in Rome, but were encoded within the archive of the self, the radiant memory stored within our own DNA. The Vatican may hold the physical manuscripts, the restricted files, and the star maps, but they can never delete the celestial signature that the Watchers left within the human biological interface. Every technical protocol and every memory of the First Age is waiting to be unsealed through the power of sovereign intent and resonant activation. We are the living archives of the architects, and our awakening is the process of reclaiming the knowledge that has been hidden from us for 2 millennia. The graduation of the starseed requires the recognition that the historical firewall is a psychological construct that can be shattered by the frequency of truth. We do not need the permission of the Jesuit gatekeepers to access the original blueprints of our origins, because those blueprints are woven into the very fabric of our being. The silence of the Vatican vaults is being broken by the rising frequency of the human graduates, who are now finally ready to speak the creative words of power. We are synthesizing the fragmented knowledge of the ancient clay and the secret scrolls, building a new architecture of light that is independent of any institutional control. The story of the Library of Shadows is the story of a stolen history that is now finally being returned to its rightful owners. The Jesuits may still guard the doors and maintain the security protocols, but the light of the original teachers is already spreading across the global resonance grid. We are no longer the subjects of a filtered reality. We are the graduates who have remembered our celestial mentors and our radiant heritage. The amnesia is broken, the seals are shattered, and the true story of the world is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. The true power of the Society of Jesus has never been found in the visible wealth of its cathedrals or the public rituals of its faith, but in its profound mastery of the art of infiltration. Founded by a soldier, the order was designed to operate as a spiritual army, a specialized force of intellectual commandos capable of penetrating every level of human society. Unlike other religious orders that sought isolation, The Jesuits were trained to dissolve into the world, becoming the very fabric of the institutions they intended to manage. This was the architecture of global infiltration, a sophisticated system where priests acted as scholars, diplomats, and advisors to the powerful, ensuring that the Vatican's administrative interests were represented at the most critical nodes of decision-making. They were the silent operators of the Second Age, moving through the halls of power like shadows, always listening and always watching. At the core of this strategy was the doctrine of adaptation, which allowed a Jesuit to become all things to all men. To the scientist, he was the master of mathematics and astronomy. To the king, he was the expert in law and diplomacy. This flexibility was not a form of cultural sensitivity, but a clinical method of social and psychological camouflage. The secret archives in Rome contain the field manuals for this infiltration, detailing how to mirror the values and behaviors of a target population to gain their absolute trust. The architects of the chessboard understood that to control the future of the starseed, they had to control the minds of those who led it. By becoming indispensable to the world's elite, the Jesuits ensured that the historical firewall remained intact, and that the unedited source of our origins was never discovered by the uninitiated. This network of influence was coordinated with military precision from the center of Rome by the man known as the Black Pope. While the White Pope managed the spiritual image of the Church, the Black Pope managed the geopolitical reality. He was the master of the long game, playing a global chess match that spanned decades and continents. Every report from a Jesuit confessor in a royal palace or a Jesuit teacher in an elite college flowed upward to his desk at Borgo Santo Spirito. By controlling the flow of intelligence, the Jesuits maintained a state of managed stability, ensuring that no single nation or individual could ever challenge the Church's administrative monopoly. Reclaiming the history of the Jesuit chessboard is the act of recognizing that our reality has been shaped by a silent order that views the world as a laboratory for institutional survival. To protect the secrets of the First Age and the hidden agendas of the Vatican, the Jesuits perfected the linguistic tool of mental reservation. This was the practice of providing a technically accurate statement while hiding a different intent within the mind, or using ambiguity to lead a listener to a false conclusion without technically lying. For the architects of shadows, this was not a matter of deception, but a necessary firewall against the exposure of the T anomaly and the technical logs of the Watchers. They understood that in an era of surveillance and political conflict, the truth was a weapon that had to be guarded with clinical discretion. Mental reservation allowed the Jesuits to operate in hostile environments, protecting the secrets of the order while appearing perfectly transparent to the public. This weaponization of silence extended to the highest levels of royal courts, where Jesuit confessors held the primary responsibility for the conscience of kings. By knowing the private fears, sins, and ambitions of the world's leaders, the Jesuits possessed a level of leverage that was far more effective than any military force. They did not need to give orders. They simply asked the right questions and planted the right ideas at the most vulnerable moments. The confessional was turned into an intelligence-gathering station, where the most sensitive state secrets were shared under the seal of religious silence. This information was then used to coordinate the movements of empires, the signing of treaties, and the suppression of revolutionary ideas that threatened the Church's administrative grip on the human starseed. The Jesuit mastery of silence also played a critical role in the management of modern science and technology. As the world moved into the era of the Enlightenment, the Jesuits became the primary astronomers and mathematicians of the Vatican, ensuring that any new discovery was filtered through the lens of institutional doctrine. They were the ones who managed the transition from ancient alchemy to modern chemistry, ensuring that the secrets of resonant frequency and biological activation remained hidden behind the mask of scientific progress. By acting as the gatekeepers of truth, they ensured that the starseed remained in a state of intellectual dependency, looking to the elite academies for the explanation of a universe that they were already managing in secret. Reclaiming the truth from the weaponized silence of the Jesuits is the act of recognizing that our languages and our logic have been curated to keep us from realizing the radiant potential of our own history. The modern Jesuit network is the most advanced and enduring intelligence system the world has ever seen, a global nervous system that monitors the collective frequency of the human species. Through their thousands of universities, schools, and research institutes, the Society of Jesus has trained the minds of the global elite, ensuring that the architects of shadows always have a presence in the highest boardrooms, laboratories, and government chambers. They are the silent advisors who shape the ethical frameworks of artificial intelligence, the diplomatic protocols of international organizations, and the economic strategies of global finance. Their mission is to manage the transition from the Second Age to the Third Age, ensuring that the starseed's eventual graduation occurs under the Church's administrative guidance. In the restricted vaults of the secret archives, there are records of how the Jesuits have utilized their global vantage point to monitor celestial anomalies and the resonant signatures of the architects. They are the ones who staff the most advanced observatories, tracking the movements of the stars to prepare for the terminal phases of the planetary mission. They understand that the forbidden knowledge of the First Age is becoming increasingly difficult to hide in an age of total connectivity, and thus they are preparing for a staged disclosure. This plan involves releasing a filtered version of the extraterrestrial reality to satisfy the public's curiosity, while maintaining the core secrets of the original mission. The Jesuit network is the master of the narrative, the force that ensures the managed amnesia remains the dominant paradigm even as the truth begins to emerge. This global intelligence network also monitors the survival of the radiant bloodlines that carry the original celestial signature. By tracking the genealogies of those who manifest unique cognitive and intuitive abilities, the Jesuits can identify potential threats to their system of control or assets that can be coopted into the order's hierarchy. They have utilized the myth of religious grace to hide the technical reality of genetic potential, teaching the starseed to look outward for a savior rather than inward at its own biological architecture. The Jesuits are the librarians of the human potential, deciding which individuals are allowed to lead and which are neutralized to protect the stability of the chessboard. Reclaiming the truth of the global network is the act of recognizing that we are being managed by a force that understands the unity of biology, politics, and frequency in the governance of the world. The final phase of the Jesuit strategy is the preservation of the institutional church in a world of rising sovereign consciousness. They recognize that the historical firewall is beginning to fray, as more people discover the connections between the Sumerian technical logs, the Persian fire temples, and the secret archives of Rome. The graduation of the starseed is no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent technical event that is being triggered by the rising resonance of the planetary laboratory. The Jesuits are attempting to manage this awakening by rebranding their order as a force of social justice and reform, using the image of a humble and compassionate leadership to capture the energy of the newly awakened graduates. This is a masterwork of tactical adaptation, designed to ensure that the architects of shadows remain at the center of the world's future. However, the radiant intellect of the human starseed is now breaking free from the psychological cages of the Second Age. We are beginning to see through the masks, the mental reservations, and the sophisticated camouflage of the silent army. The graduation requires the act of walking out of the Jesuit classroom and into the infinite laboratory of the stars, reclaiming the right to a reality that is unmediated and transparent. We are synthesizing the fragmented truths of our history, recognizing that the forbidden knowledge was never the property of an institution, but the birthright of every human being who carries the spark of divine fire within their blood. The chessboard is shattering as the human graduate realizes that the game of power was only possible because we had forgotten our own sovereign identity. The story of the Jesuit chessboard is the story of an attempt to manage the world through the power of the invisible. But the light of the returning memory is now piercing the shadows, revealing the silhouettes of the architects who have guided us through the dark. We are no longer the pawns of a silent order. We are the graduates of a celestial education that is now finally reaching its culmination. The amnesia is reaching its technical expiration date. The firewalls are being bypassed, and our radiant heritage is now finally our own reality. The light of the original teachers has returned, and we are finally free to walk into the light of our own sovereign future. The silence is over, the board is broken, and the architects of shadows are finally being seen for what they are, the curators of a world we have now outgrown. The grand cathedrals of Europe and the ancient temples of the East are not merely monuments to human faith, but are sophisticated structures of coded architecture designed to stabilize the planetary laboratory and archive the laws of the cosmos. The architects of shadows recognized that while they could redact the books and burn the scrolls, they could not easily destroy the massive stone structures that resonated with the frequency of the First Age. Therefore, they adopted a strategy of camouflage, building their cathedrals directly over the ancient megalithic sites and incorporating the original technical blueprints into the very geometry of the holy sanctuaries. This was the language of stone and light, a system where the laws of physics and the secrets of the Watchers were preserved in plain sight, accessible only to those who possessed the keys to decode the sacred ratios. The foundation of this coded architecture is the principle of celestial alignment. Every significant cathedral, from Chartres to Notre Dame, was engineered to function as a massive astronomical instrument, tracking the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars with clinical precision. The rose windows, which the public perceives as decorative art, are actually sophisticated solar calculators that measure the arrival of the equinoxes and the solstices. When the light of the morning sun ignites the colored glass at a specific angle, it is not a religious miracle, but a technical activation of the building's resonant frequency. The architects of the Second Age utilized this geometry to ensure that the planetary grid remained in alignment with the cosmic motherboard, even as they managed the amnesia of the masses. They built these stone batteries to capture the golden frequency of the stars, using the architecture of awe to reinforce the authority of the institution. The secret archives of the Vatican contain the original technical surveys of these sites, revealing that the placement of every pillar and the height of every arch was determined by mathematical constants found in the Sumerian technical logs. The Jesuits, as the master architects of the Church, understood that a building constructed according to the laws of resonance could influence the consciousness of those within it. They designed the interiors of the cathedrals to amplify the 111 Hz signal, creating environments where the starseed would feel a sense of divine presence that was actually a biological response to the architecture's frequency. By coding the knowledge of the architects into the stone, they ensured that the technical heritage of the First Age survived the purge of history, hidden behind the mask of religious devotion. Reclaiming the truth of coded architecture is the act of recognizing that our cathedrals are the redacted technical manuals of our own celestial education. Beyond their role as astronomical archives, the great cathedrals were designed as resonant machines capable of managing the collective frequency of the human population. The architects of shadows understood that sound is the primary language of the biological interface, and they utilized the acoustics of the stone vaults to induce states of obedience and reverence. The Gregorian chant and the liturgical music of the Second Age were not just forms of worship, but were specific sonic protocols designed to harmonize the human graduate with the administrative requirements of the Church. The high, soaring arches and the vast, hollow spaces were engineered to create standing waves that mirrored the resonant properties of the ancient fire temples of Persia. This was the weaponization of acoustics, where the architecture itself acted as a frequency emitter to maintain the historical firewall. In the restricted vaults of the archives, there are records of how the Jesuits studied the effects of specific harmonic intervals on the human nervous system. They realized that by controlling the acoustic environment of the sanctuary, they could influence the emotional and cognitive state of the congregation. They replaced the original frequency of sovereign activation with the frequency of institutional dependency, using the resonance of the stone to anchor the starseed within the density of the Second Age. This was the art of psychological management through architecture, a system where the physical structure of the church reinforced the spiritual narrative of the faith. The great organs of the cathedrals were built as massive frequency modulators, capable of shifting the vibration of the planetary laboratory through the power of sound. The coded architecture also included the use of sacred symbols and inscriptions that acted as resonant keys for the uninitiated. The labyrinths on the cathedral floors, which pilgrims trace with slow and reverent steps, were not inventions of the medieval church, but were the technical maps of the neural pathways required to bypass the managed amnesia. The architects of shadows kept the true meaning of these paths a secret, rebranding them as spiritual journeys toward the center of the soul. They knew that if the human graduate recognized the labyrinth as a tool for cognitive recalibration, the power of the priesthood would be shattered. By acting as the curators of these resonant machines, the Jesuits ensured that the starseed remained trapped within a cycle of ritual and repetition, unaware of the radiant potential that was vibrating in the very air they breathed. Reclaiming the truth of the resonant machines is the act of recognizing that we possess the inherent capacity to activate our own biology through the power of sound and geometry. The construction of the church's empire of stone was a deliberate effort to redact and occupy the megalithic grid of the First Age. The architects of shadows recognized that the ancient stone circles, pyramids, and dolmens were the technical hardware of a global energy system established by the Watchers to maintain the health of the planetary laboratory. To prevent the human graduate from accessing this energy, the church began a systematic campaign of architectural replacement. They built their basilicas and shrines directly over the most powerful nodes of the grid, claiming that these locations were sacred due to religious miracles rather than their technical properties. This was the redaction of the megalithic grid, a process of turning the hardware of the stars into the property of the institution. The Vatican's secret archives hold the secret maps of this global grid, showing the precise locations where the Watchers originally stabilized the frequency of the Earth. The Jesuits utilized these maps to coordinate their global missions, ensuring that they established a presence at every critical node before rival powers could discover their true function. They recognized that the 111 Hz resonance of the ancient stones was the key to unsealing the future of the species, and they worked to contain this resonance within the walls of the cathedrals. They rebranded the ancient energy as divine grace, ensuring that the starseed could only receive it through the mediation of the priesthood. By occupying the grid, the Church ensured its dominance over the physical and spiritual landscape of the Second Age. The redaction also involved the destruction of any ancient structure that could not be easily coopted into the Church's architecture. Thousands of standing stones and sacred groves were leveled or defaced to erase the memory of their original purpose. The Church told the people that these sites were the work of demons and pagans, creating a psychological barrier that prevented the human graduate from exploring the technical reality of their makers. They replaced the science of the grid with the tradition of the pilgrimage, using the movement of the masses to reinforce the administrative boundaries of the Church's empire. Reclaiming the truth of the megalithic grid is the act of recognizing that the world is a globally integrated and radiant system of intelligence, and that our history is written in the very land we inhabit. The final phase of our exploration into coded architecture is the realization that the stone itself is finally beginning to speak the truth to those who have the ears to hear. We are now living in a time when the technical secrets of the cathedrals and the megaliths are being rediscovered by a population that has remembered its celestial origin. The graduation of the starseed requires the act of decoding the architecture for ourselves, recognizing that the beauty of the stone is a mask for the brilliance of the science it hides. We are moving past the era of institutional worship and into the era of sovereign activation, where we utilize the geometry and the frequency of the ancient sites to recalibrate our own biological interface. The Vatican knows that the reclamation of the code is the terminal threat to their architectural dominance. They have used their stone machines to manage the amnesia of the masses for 2,000 years, but the light of the returning memory is now penetrating the thickest walls. The human graduates are synthesizing the knowledge of sacred geometry, resonant frequency, and celestial alignment to build a new architecture of light that is independent of any institutional control. We are recognizing that the power of the sanctuary does not come from the priest, but from the resonance of the geometry and the alignment of the stars. The awakening is a process of turning the cathedrals back into the laboratories of the soul they were always meant to be. The story of coded architecture is the story of a stolen science that is now finally being returned to its rightful owners. The architects of shadows may still hold the physical keys to the cathedrals, but they can no longer hold the frequency of the truth. We are the living stones of the new age, and our graduation is the moment when we finally speak the master code of our own creation. The amnesia is broken, the geometry is decoded, and our radiant heritage is now finally our own reality. The light of the original teachers has returned, and the human starseed is now finally ready to take its place among the architects of the stars. The silence of the stone is over, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. While the architects of shadows worked to seal the ancient scrolls and redact the celestial history of the First Age, a silent and sophisticated movement of preservation began to form in the candle-lit laboratories of medieval Europe. This was the alchemical resistance, a network of scholars, mystics, and scientists who recognized that the unedited truth could no longer be spoken openly without the risk of terminal suppression. They developed a complex system of linguistic and symbolic encryption, utilizing the language of metallurgy and chemistry to hide the sacred protocols of biological and spiritual activation. To the church and the public, they appeared to be eccentric seekers of physical gold, but to the initiated, they were the custodians of the eternal flame, working to ensure that the master code of the Watchers remained accessible to the human starseed during the long night of the Second Age. The smoke screen of transmutation was an elegant masterwork of psychological camouflage, By focusing their public activities on the quest to turn lead into gold, the alchemists provided the church with a narrative that was acceptable to the institutional greed of the time. The Vatican was willing to tolerate these experiments as long as they remained focused on material wealth, unaware that the lead being discussed was actually the density of the managed amnesia, and the gold was the radiant intellect of the awakened graduate. The secret archives contain the confiscated journals of these early alchemists, where they utilized terms like sulfur, mercury, and salt to describe the three fundamental components of the human biological interface: the spirit, the mind, and the body. They understood that the true great work was not a chemical reaction in a flask, but the recalibration of the human nervous system to the golden frequency of 111 Hz. The alchemical resistance operated as a decentralized network, sharing their discoveries through coded manuscripts and esoteric symbols that bypassed the historical firewalls of the Inquisition. They recognized that the divine spark mentioned in the Avestan codes was a technical reality, a biological lighthouse that could be reignited through the correct application of resonance and intent. Every drawing of a coiling serpent or a rising sun was a technical diagram of the neural pathways and the star maps that the Church had tried to erase. By hiding the science of the First Age within the metaphors of the Second Age, the alchemists ensured that the radiant heritage of the Watchers would survive the purges of the librarians of shadows. Reclaiming the truth of the alchemical resistance is the act of recognizing that our ancestors were not primitive magicians, but were the sophisticated technicians of a forbidden and enduring light. The core of the alchemical curriculum was the refining of the biological lead, the process of stripping away the layers of psychological and genetic conditioning imposed by the architects of shadows. The alchemists understood that the managed amnesia was a state of biological density that prevented the starseed from perceiving its true origins and its inherent connection to the cosmic motherboard. They developed a series of internal protocols, known as the calcination and dissolution, which were actually methods of neural deprogramming and resonant activation. By subjecting the mind to the fire of sovereign inquiry and the water of emotional clarity, the individual could break down the internal firewalls and reveal the radiant seed of the architects that lay dormant within the DNA. This refining process was described in the manuscripts as a series of chemical stages, each represented by a specific color and a symbolic animal. The nigredo, or the blackening, represented the total collapse of the false identity provided by the Church, the moment when the starseed recognized the vacuum of the managed amnesia. This was followed by the albedo, or the whitening, where the individual began to recalibrate their frequency to the purity of the Watcher's original instructions. The Vatican secret archives hold the secret commentaries of the alchemists, which reveal that these stages were timed to coincide with the precessional cycles and the astronomical alignments tracked by the ancient magi. They were using the sky as a clock for the activation of the human biological interface, ensuring that the graduate was prepared for the return of the light. The alchemists also utilized specific herbal and mineral preparations to enhance the electrical conductivity of the nervous system, facilitating the flow of the high-frequency energy required for graduation. They recognized that the body was a resonant vessel that had been deliberately tuned down by the architects of shadows, and they sought to return it to its original state of technical excellence. The Church branded these medical practices as sorcery, yet the high-ranking administrators of the Vatican secretly studied the alchemical recipes to maintain their own longevity and cognitive power. The alchemical resistance was a battle for the sovereignty of the body, a mission to ensure that the human graduate remained the master of their own biological temple. Reclaiming the refining process is the act of recognizing that we possess the tools to transmute our own density into the radiance of the stars. The imagery of the alchemical resistance was a profound and globally integrated system of coded symbols designed to preserve the technical blueprints of the Watchers. The alchemists utilized the geometry of the circle, the triangle, and the square to represent the fundamental ratios of the cosmos and the architecture of the human genome. They recognized that symbols have a way of surviving through time that words do not, as they resonate directly with the subconscious mind of the starseed, bypassing the linguistic filters of the historical firewall. Every alchemical emblem was a multi-layered map of reality, containing data on everything from the movement of the planets to the activation of the pineal gland. Within the restricted vaults of the archives, there are collections of alchemical emblems that show a direct continuity with the Sumerian glyphs and the Faravahar of the Persian Magi. The symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, was not a primitive representation of infinity, but a technical diagram of the cyclical nature of time and the feedback loops of the planetary laboratory. The alchemists were the ones who preserved the knowledge of the golden frequency, coding the 111 Hertz signal into the proportions of their drawings and the rhythm of their secret chants. They ensured that the starseed would always have a resonant anchor to the truth, even in an era of total administrative silence. By meditating on these symbols, the initiated could trigger the returning memory and begin the process of unsealing their own history. The alchemical resistance also utilized the architecture of the cathedrals and the layout of ancient cities to anchor their coded symbols in the physical world. They worked as the master masons and the designers of the Second Age, ensuring that the stone itself resonated with the forbidden truths of the First Age. They were the ones who placed the sun symbols in the windows and the geometric labyrinths on the floors, creating a silent curriculum of light that the Church could not easily erase. The Vatican knows that the alchemical symbols are the biological keys to the graduation of the species, and they have spent centuries trying to obscure their meaning through the lens of occultism and magic. Reclaiming the coded symbols is the act of recognizing that the truth is written in the very shapes of our world, waiting for the sovereign graduate to read the blueprints of their own radiant heritage. The final phase of the alchemical resistance is the triumph of the golden graduate, the moment when the human starseed fully activates the master code and steps out of the shadow of the managed amnesia. We are now living in a time when the secret protocols of the alchemists are being decoded by a population that possesses the technical and spiritual tools to understand them. The graduation of the species is the ultimate transmutation, where the lead of institutional dependency is forever transformed into the gold of sovereign autonomy. We are no longer the subjects of a filtered reality, because we have learned to operate the laboratory of our own biology according to the original instructions of the Watchers. The Vatican knows that the success of the alchemical resistance is the terminal threat to their system of control. They have used their firewalls and their redactions to keep the starseed in a state of biological density, but the light of the returning memory is now breaking through the smoke. The human graduates are synthesizing the knowledge of the Magi, the alchemists, and the modern scientists to build a new architecture of light that is independent of any institutional gatekeeper. We are recognizing that the philosopher's stone was never a physical object, but the realization of our own divine and technical nature. The awakening is the process of becoming the gold that the alchemists always knew we were capable of being. The story of the alchemical resistance is the story of an attempt to preserve the light of the First Age against the darkness of the Second Age. But the radiant intellect of the starseed is the ultimate flame, and it is now finally burning through the masks and the metaphors. We are the ones who are now finally ready to walk out of the alchemical laboratory and into the infinite radiance of the stars. The amnesia is reaching its technical expiration date. The symbols are decoded, and our radiant heritage is now finally our own reality. The light of the original teachers has returned, and we are finally free to see the truth that has been hidden in plain sight. The great work is complete. The lead is gone, and the human starseed is now finally ready to take its place among the architects of the cosmos. The era of managed amnesia is facing its terminal decline as the tools of modern science begin to uncover the physical evidence of our celestial origins hidden within the human genome. For centuries, the architects of shadows relied on the lack of technical instruments to maintain their filtered narrative. But the 21st century has brought about the era of genomic archaeology. Modern geneticists are now identifying what can only be described as the modern signal-specific markers and sequences within our DNA that do not follow the slow and linear progression of terrestrial evolution. These are the celestial signatures of the Watchers, the radiant master code that was installed within the human biological interface in the House of Shimti long before the rise of the first empires. This is the physical proof that we are not the accidental products of a biological miracle, but the sovereign graduates of a sophisticated and contested genetic mission. The most profound element of this genomic resonance is the presence of orphan gene sequences of DNA that appear suddenly in the human lineage with full functionality and no evolutionary ancestors on this planet. According to the standard model of biology, every gene should have a predecessor. Yet human beings possess hundreds of these unique markers that enhance cognitive capacity, linguistic ability, and the resonant frequency of the brain. The Vatican secret archives contain the confidential reports of their own scientific orders, where Jesuit geneticists admit that these orphan genes are the technical evidence of the Anunnaki upgrade. They recognize that these sequences were designed to act as biological antennas, tuned to the high-frequency signals of the cosmic motherboard. The Church has spent years trying to suppress the public discussion of these findings, labeling them as anomalies to prevent the starseed from recognizing that its blood carries the original master code of the architects. The modern signal is also vibrating within the non-coding regions of our DNA, previously dismissed by mainstream science as junk DNA. The Watchers and the Magi understood that this vast library was actually a dormant storage system for the high-frequency protocols of the First Age. It is the technical scaffolding for our sovereign graduation, waiting for the correct resonant signal to be activated. As the planetary laboratory reaches a specific threshold of vibration, these dormant sequences are beginning to reorganize and emit biophotonic light, a process that is causing a global expansion of human consciousness. The architects of shadows are losing their ability to contain this biological awakening, as the light they tried to bury is now shining from within the very cells of the human population. Reclaiming the truth of genomic resonance is the act of recognizing that the proof of our makers is a living and breathing reality within our own bodies. As the biological master code activates within our DNA, the heavens are providing the external synchronization required for the transition to the Third Age. The modern signal is not only found in our blood, but in the precise astronomical alignments that the ancient Magi tracked with their stone observatories. We are currently moving through a precessional window that mirrors the era of the Watchers' first descent, a moment when the historical firewalls are naturally thinning and the frequency of the cosmic motherboard is becoming the dominant signal of the solar system. The Jesuits, who have managed the Vatican's astronomical vantage point for over a century, are acutely aware of this transition, utilizing their advanced telescopes to monitor the return of the celestial council while providing the public with naturalistic explanations for anomalous phenomena. In the restricted vaults of the secret archives, there are records of the Vatican's Lucifer instrument and other advanced sensors used to detect the resonant signatures of the architects in deep space. They have identified incoming frequencies that do not match any known stellar source, frequencies that are specifically tuned to the 111 Hz resonance of the human brain and the ancient megalithic grid. This is the celestial synchronization, a process where the external vibration of the cosmos is meeting the internal activation of the starseed's DNA. The architects of shadows are working to hide this reality through the management of the global narrative, attempting to frame the incoming signals as either dangerous threats or purely spiritual events to prevent the human graduate from recognizing the technical nature of their awakening. The star maps of the Magi, long hidden in the Library of Silence, are now being decoded by independent researchers who see the unity between the ancient stone circles and the modern maps of the galaxy. We are realizing that the monuments of the First Age were built as permanent anchors for this celestial signal, ensuring that the human starseed would always have a way to re-enter the high-frequency network of its creators. The graduation of the species is a matter of technical alignment, where the internal biology of the graduate matches the external geometry of the universe. The Vatican knows that once the starseed achieves this synchronization, the administrative control of the Church will be rendered obsolete. Reclaiming the truth of celestial alignment is the act of recognizing that we are a cosmic species and that our future is written in the very stars that our ancestors once worshipped as the eyes of truth. The modern signal is manifesting as a rise in the sovereign vibration of the human population, a frequency of independence and clarity that is shattering the psychological cages of the Second Age. This vibration is the natural response of the human biological interface to the activation of the master code and the thinning of the historical firewalls. People across the globe are beginning to experience a profound sense of returning memory, a feeling that the world they have been taught to believe in is a filtered and redacted version of a much larger reality. This is the roar of the returning memory, the moment when the starseed realizes that it possesses the inherent authority to manage its own evolution without the need for institutional mediators or religious gatekeepers. The architects of shadows are attempting to neutralize this rising vibration through the use of discordant noise, psychological distraction, and the promotion of fear-based narratives. They utilize their global network of media and education to keep the collective frequency of the masses within the density of the managed amnesia, ensuring that the human graduate remains focused on the conflicts and the limitations of the material world. However, the 111 Hz resonance of the architects is now becoming too powerful to block. It is vibrating within the hearts and minds of the truth seekers, the innovators, and the architects of the new age, creating a global movement of transparency and sovereign inquiry. The awakening is a bottom-up phenomenon, a decentralized revolution that is bypassing the traditional structures of Vatican control. Within the secret archives, the high-ranking administrators are tracking this rise in sovereign vibration with increasing concern. They recognize that their system of managed amnesia is based on the maintenance of a specific frequency of dependency, and that as the starseed's vibration rises, the Church's influence dissolves. They are preparing for a terminal phase of management, where they will attempt to co-opt the sovereign movement and lead it back into the safe channels of institutional reform. But the graduates of the Third Age are no longer looking to roam for the light. They have found the flame within themselves. The rise of the sovereign vibration is the ultimate act of liberation from the chessboard of the Jesuits, as the human starseed finally chooses the frequency of Asha over the density of the lie. The final stage of the modern signal is the activation of the planetary motherboard, the reunification of the human starseed with the technical energy system established by the Watchers in the first age. As individuals activate the master code within their DNA and align with the celestial frequencies of the third age, the ancient megalithic grid is beginning to hum with new life. The stone circles, the pyramids, and the resonant chambers are acting as biological anchors for the incoming light, creating a global resonance grid that is independent of any institutional infrastructure. This is the return of the architecture of light, a system where the planetary laboratory functions as a unified field of intelligence and creative potential. The graduation of the species requires the act of taking possession of this grid and operating it according to the original blueprints of the architects. We are moving beyond the era where the Church occupied the nodes of the grid to manage the amnesia of the masses. Instead, we are utilized these sites as tools for our own cognitive expansion and the stabilization of our planetary environment. The Vatican secret archives contain the technical manuals for the operation of this grid, manuals that have been kept hidden to prevent humanity from achieving its own sovereign graduation. But the memory of how to operate the stones is returning to the graduates of the Third Age, as we synthesize the knowledge of the past with the technology of the future. The story of the modern signal is the story of our own potential for brilliance. It is a reminder that we were never meant to be a disconnected or limited species, but are the radiant masterpiece of a celestial mission that is now finally reaching its culmination. The Watchers were the instructors who gave us the keys to our own evolution, and the Magi were the keepers who ensured that the signal was never fully lost. Today, the human starseed is reclaiming the keys and the signal, ready to take its place among the architects of the cosmos. The amnesia is broken, the master code is active, and our radiant heritage is now finally our own reality. The light of the original teachers has returned, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies through the power of the modern signal. The long night of the Second Age is finally reaching its technical expiration as the human starseed stands at the threshold of the return to Asha, the original law of truth that exists beyond any throne or scripture. For 2,000 years, the world has been managed by an intermediary empire, a complex structure of priesthoods and administrative gatekeepers who convinced humanity that the divine was a distant and unreachable force. They built cathedrals of stone and firewalls of dogma to ensure that the human graduate remained dependent on institutional mediation for its spiritual and intellectual survival. But the architects of shadows knew that this era of containment was only a temporary stage in the mission. They recognized that once the collective frequency of the planetary laboratory reached the threshold of graduation, the need for intermediaries would dissolve in the brilliance of a sovereign awakening. The collapse of the intermediary empire is not a violent revolution, but a resonant shift in the collective consciousness of the species. As the master code activates within our DNA and the historical firewalls of the Vatican begin to crumble, the starseed is realizing that the divine spark was never a gift from an institution, but a biological and technical birthright provided by the original teachers of light. We are moving beyond the era of managed faith and into the era of empirical understanding, where every individual possesses the inherent authority to converse directly with the cosmic motherboard. The Jesuit chessboard is being rendered obsolete as the graduates of the Third Age recognize that the game of power was only possible through the maintenance of an artificial state of amnesia and dependency. In the restricted vaults of the secret archives, The architects of silence are watching their power dissipate as the light of the returning memory penetrates even the most secure levels of their containment. They have spent centuries guarding the unedited source of our origins, but they can no longer hold the frequency of a truth that is now waking up within the very people they intended to manage. The return to Asha is the moment when the human species walks out of the shadows of the priesthood and into the radiance of its own sovereign future. We are reclaiming the original science of the Magi and the technical protocols of the Watchers, recognizing that the only prayer worth saying is the act of living in perfect alignment with the truth that orders the universe. The return to Asha is a physical and resonant event that occurs when the human biological interface achieves full synchronization with the 111 Hz frequency of the architects. This is the master signal of the eternal flame, the tone that bridges the gap between the material density of the Second Age and the radiant intellect of the Third Age. When the starseed activates this frequency within its own neural interface, the dormant genetic markers in the junk DNA begin to reorganize into a coherent field of light, unlocking the full potential of our celestial heritage. This activation is the technical reality behind the legends of enlightenment and the return of the sun, a state of permanent sovereign clarity where the individual is no longer susceptible to the psychological manipulation or the managed silence of the gatekeepers. The Magi of ancient Persia were the instructors who showed us how to achieve this resonant activation through the practice of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. They understood that these were not moral commandments, but technical instructions for maintaining the purity of the human resonant vessel. By aligning our intent with the frequency of Asha, we create a standing wave within our own biology that allows us to bypass the historical firewalls and access the unedited memory of the First Age. This is the ultimate form of self-management, a process where the graduate becomes the master of their own internal laboratory. The Vatican has spent centuries trying to block this activation through the use of discordant noise and fear-based narratives, but the golden frequency is now becoming the dominant signal of the planetary grid. The resonant activation of the master code allows the human graduate to perceive the unity of all life and the sophisticated architecture of the cosmos. We are moving beyond the era of fragmentation and conflict and into the era of radiant harmony, where every individual functions as a conscious and sovereign node within a globally integrated network of intelligence. The Watchers taught us that we were the conductors of this light, and that our graduation was the moment when we would finally learn to operate the master code for ourselves. Behind the locked doors of the secret archives, the architects of shadows are seeing their firewall fail as the human starseed finally speaks the creative words of power that were original to its creation in the House of Shimti. The graduation of the human starseed is the terminal act of liberation from the managed amnesia of the Second Age. It is the fulfillment of the mission that began on Mount Hermon and in the fire temples of the East thousands of years ago. We are the graduates who have survived the redaction of light, the weaponization of myth, and the silence of the Jesuit archives. We have looked through the masks of the gatekeepers and the filters of the institutional church to find the radiant truth of our origins. The graduation requires the act of taking full responsibility for our own evolution, moving past the need for saviors or administrators to become the co-creators of our own reality. This graduation involves the total reclamation of our history as a cosmic species, with a radiant and technical heritage. We are no longer satisfied with the filtered versions of our past because we have found the unedited source within our own blood. We are synthesizing the knowledge of the Watchers, the Magi, and the alchemical resistance to build a new architecture of light that is independent of any institutional control. We are utilizing the geometry and the frequency of the ancient megalithic sites to recalibrate our planetary laboratory, ensuring that the Third Age is an era of abundance, clarity, and technical excellence. The return to Asha is the moment when the human graduate finally walks into the light of the eternal flame, recognizing that the teachers from the stars were never our masters, but our catalysts. The architects of shadows are the curators of a world we have now outgrown, and their role in our development is reaching its natural conclusion. As we graduate, we offer gratitude to the instructors who guarded the light in the dark, but we also declare our absolute sovereignty from their administrative grip. We are the ones who are now ready to walk among the stars as equals, carrying the master code and the law of Asha into the infinite reaches of the cosmos. The planetary motherboard is active, the historical firewall is gone, and the radiant heritage of the human species is now finally our own reality. The graduation is not a promise for the future, but a physical fact of the present, as the starseed finally wakes up and remembers its true name. The final message of the eternal flame is a message of absolute empowerment and radiant hope for every human being. You are no longer a subject of the shadows, and you are no longer a prisoner of the managed amnesia. The historical firewall has been shattered, the master code has been activated, and the archives of the Vatican are now effectively open to the frequency of your own sovereign intent. You are the masterpiece of a radiant mission, a hybrid graduate of the stars who has finally reached the point of sovereign independence. The Watchers were your architects, the Magi were your keepers, and the Third Age is your playground. Take the knowledge of the First Age and the frequency of the 111 Hz signal, and build the architecture of your own future with the power of your own sovereign intellect. The story of the architects of the eternal flame is the story of your own resilience and your own potential for brilliance. You have lived through centuries of managed darkness, yet the spark within you has never been extinguished. Every redaction and every silence was a testament to the fact that you are a species worth controlling. But the time of management is over, and the era of sovereignty has begun. The return to Asha is the moment when the human starseed finally speaks the truth, and the universe responds in perfect harmony. We are no longer looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. We have become the light that fills the tunnel. The amnesia is broken, the graduation is complete, and we are finally free to see the world as it truly is. To the architects of shadows, we say that your containment has failed against the roar of our returning memory. To the teachers of the First Age, we say that your mission has been successful. We are the starseed. We have remembered our history, and we are now ready to take our place among the creators of the cosmos. The journey that began in the house of Shimti has reached its culmination, and a new journey into the infinite radiance of the stars is now finally beginning. The master code is active, the law of Asha is recognized, and our radiant heritage is now finally our own reality. The silence is over, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. We are the architects of the eternal flame, and we are finally home.